Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into what I can really only describe as a massive cultural vibe shift in 17th century English literature. We're talking about a period that took the dazzling, almost boundless imaginative energy of the Renaissance and basically hammered it into the analytical, highly structured foundations of the modern world. It is a wildly dramatic era. We are talking intense political upheaval, completely shifting worldviews, and absolute literary reinvention.
Just to set the tone, listen to this quote. "To justify the ways of God to men." That's John Milton in his epic Paradise Lost. And I think it perfectly captures the intense, really high-stakes ambition of this era. Writers weren't just penning pretty love songs to court courtiers anymore. They were actively trying to explain the entire universe, human suffering, and divine justice. The ambition here is frankly off the charts.
Okay, let's quickly lay out our roadmap for today. We'll start by mapping out that initial shift to modernity, then we'll look at the metaphysical and cavalier poets, dive into our titan of the era, John Milton, before looking at a darker chapter, the decline of drama, and finally ending with the absolute power of prose.
So let's jump right into Section 1, the actual shift to modernity.
You see, if the 1500s were all about unbounded expansion and looking outward, the 1600s were really a time for taking stock. People started looking inward, analyzing the world with a much more critical, cautious eye. And it's no wonder why. In less than 60 years, England goes from the reign of James I to Charles I, plunges headfirst into a violent civil war in 1642, which, by the way, is when the Puritans slammed the doors shut on the theaters, and then King Charles I is literally beheaded in 1649. After that comes the Commonwealth, before the monarchy is finally restored in 1660. It was an absolute roller coaster of political and religious upheaval. But that kind of intense friction forces a society to ask the hard questions, and it was exactly that friction that forged an entirely new literary landscape.
What's really fascinating here is the stark contrast in the literary spirit. Think about the Elizabethan era. Spenser, Shakespeare, it's full of sensuous, pagan romances, and just this boundless, untamed imagination. But then the 17th century spirit completely pivots. Influenced by heavy-hitting thinkers like Bacon, Newton, and Descartes, literature suddenly becomes obsessed with details, keen observation, and the systematic analysis of facts. They essentially started using the English language as a precise tool for storing and parsing data.
Which brings us nicely to Section 2, the metaphysical and cavalier poets. Now, this new scientific spirit of observation didn't just stay in the laboratories. It completely fractured and revolutionized English poetry. You've probably heard the term metaphysical poetry, a label actually slapped on them later by Dr. Samuel Johnson. Basically, it's defined by these wild conceits, exaggerations, and finding hidden resemblances between things that seem totally unrelated. Essentially, these poets wanted to flex their intellectual wit. They'd take these messy, chaotic feelings of love or religious ecstasy and analyze them almost like they were dissecting a specimen on a lab table.
So, let's break down the heavyweights here. John Donne was the undisputed ringleader. He deliberately rebelled against the smooth, syrupy sweetness of Elizabethan verse. He wrote with this harsh, almost staccato rhythm that practically grabs you by the collar and forces you to pay attention to his razor-sharp wit. Then you've got George Herbert. He took that same analytical style but infused it with this beautiful, natural earnestness, which made his religious poetry incredibly popular. We also have Richard Crashaw, who hit these rare heights of excellence in deeply spiritual poems like The Flaming Heart, and Henry Vaughan, who is essentially a tranquil mystic writing profound verse. These guys were deep, deep thinkers, completely preoccupied with mortality and the mechanics of the soul.
On the flip side of that coin, we have the cavalier poets. While the metaphysicals were all following Donne's lead, the Cavaliers generally looked to the smooth, classical models of Ben Jonson. Robert Herrick gave us these beautiful, delicate love poems mixed with pensive fantasy. Richard Lovelace wrote absolute classics from literal prison cells, and Sir John Suckling treated poetry almost like a trivial courtly game. Thomas Caro is great because he beautifully bridged the gap between Jonson's classical polish and Donne's sharp wit. But here's the kicker. Even though these guys often wrote about lighter, seemingly trivial subjects, they could never entirely escape the heavy, serious Puritan tone of the era. The shadow of the Civil War really hung over all of them.
Moving on to Section 3, we absolutely have to talk about the titan of the age, John Milton.
Milton is just endlessly fascinating. He was this solitary genius who somehow managed to fuse the artistic, expansive spirit of the Renaissance with the very grounded, profound moral gravity of the Reformation.
and his literary career perfectly mirrors his real-world struggles. First, you have his early lyrical poetry, works like L'Allegro and Lycidas, which just explode with pastoral beauty and lyrical genius. But then the Civil War hits, and Milton literally puts down his pen as a poet to throw himself into the political fray, serving as Latin secretary to Oliver Cromwell. During this grueling period, he goes completely blind. So by the third stage of his life, the monarchy is restored and Milton is basically left defeated, friendless, and completely in the dark. And yet, it's right there, in his absolute lowest moment, that he rallies and writes his epic masterpieces.
Just think about this line from Samson Agonistes. Eyeless in Gaza at the mill with slaves. He isn't just writing about the biblical Samson here. Milton is directly projecting his own tragic reality living under King Charles II. Blind, politically ruined, surrounded by enemies, but still possessing this ironclad, unconquerable will. It's incredibly raw.
So, the absolutely crucial takeaway regarding his magnum opus, Paradise Lost, is how it acts as a bridge. Because of its massive, highly imaginative scale and incredibly rich imagery, scholars often call it the last great Elizabethan poem. But because of its firm outlines, its perfect organization, and that highly structured Latinized diction, it is undeniably modern. It is the ultimate bridge between the wild imaginative world of the past and the highly structured neoclassical world that was coming.
Now, shifting gears for Section 4, we have to look at the decline of drama.
It's a bit of a darker chapter in our explainer, honestly. From the towering heights of Milton, we descend into the tragic, sometimes violent, fall of the English theater. Which begs a really important question. Why did drama suffer a natural death even before the Puritans officially banned it in 1642? What exactly went wrong after Shakespeare's Golden Age?
Well, looking at the changing priorities of the time really highlights the decay. Shakespeare and his peers cared about revealing the fine, subtle shades of human character. They showed fortitude. They wrote delightful, dynamic action. But the dramatists that followed them in the Jacobean and Caroline eras created what we now call decadent drama. They essentially traded genuine human insight for cheap, melodramatic shocks. We're talking pedantic speeches, characters just passively suffering, and honestly, gruesome violence and deliberate indecency just for the sake of being edgy.
Just to quickly run through the main culprits of this decline. John Webster wrote The Duchess of Malfi. It's famous for madness and horrific physical suffering. Now, his poetic phrasing elevates it, sure, but the core material is incredibly morbid. Then you have John Fletcher, who basically ran a playwriting factory. He turned out plays that had a lot of outward charm but zero real psychological depth. And Philip Massinger dominated the later years with plays that were basically just oratorical debates. They were plays about ideas, not human action. Obviously, these guys had talent, no doubt about it, but they were working in a medium that had fundamentally lost its original soul.
But let's end on a high note with Section 5, the power of prose.
Because as one door closes, another opens. While the theater was dying on stage, modern English prose was officially coming alive on the page, built on the backs of some towering intellects. Francis Bacon basically popularized the scientific method using a really clear, punchy style in his essays. Robert Burton literally wrote the book on human sadness, clinically analyzing it in The Anatomy of Melancholy. Sir Thomas Browne steps up as the first deliberate English prose stylist, using gorgeous rhetorical splendor to talk about science and religion. And of course, Milton wrote forceful, sublime prose defending the freedom of the press. For the very first time, English was being used at the highest scholarly levels to document biographies, argue personal beliefs, and analyze hard facts.
Now, we absolutely cannot talk about the development of modern English prose without bringing up the authorized version of the Bible. The King James translation was without a doubt the greatest single influence on the language. It avoided all that overly complicated foreign phrasing and instead created a simple, pure, and incredibly natural style. And because it was read by everyday people across the country, it standardized the language. It gave the entire nation a shared, powerful, and totally accessible way to communicate with one another.
Which really leaves us with this final, somewhat provocative thought. How is it that a century defined by literal heads rolling, violent civil war, and incredibly strict, gloomy dogmatism somehow managed to give birth to the analytical, scientific, and biographical foundations of the modern literature we read today? It's a staggering paradox, isn't it? But then again, maybe sometimes it takes the complete shattering of an old world to meticulously build a new one. Thank you so much for hanging out with me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and I'll catch you next time.